Hello and welcome to Colred Plays Raid Shadow Legends. I am Colred. Thank you for joining me. In today's video, we are going to talk about champion roles. Now that may not sound like a big deal, but I actually think this is going to be one of the most important videos I've ever made. Every other video that talks about champion roles kind of picks one corner of the topic, maybe handles one kind of role or one kind of champion or a team composition for a particular fight. But in today's video, we are going to get into all of it. We're going to talk about all of the theory behind building a team composition. It's going to help you determine which champions are good and which aren't, which ones you want a 6-star, and how you want to put champions together to build team compositions for each and every fight in Raid Shadow Legends. I've actually been putting this video off for a while because it's kind of daunting, and I wanted to make sure that I did it well for you and also for myself. So before we even get started, I'm going to ask you to do a bunch of things. One, go ahead and bookmark this video right now because you're going to want to come back and rewatch this several times, especially if you are a newer player or even a mid-game player. My guess is even some of you experienced players are going to find a lot of value in this video. The second thing you can do is hit the like button right now. Let's get this video out in front of as many eyes as possible. In fact, if you're willing, go ahead and link this video to your Discord communities, to your clan communities, so that we can help as many players as possible. All right, I'm pretty jazzed. I'm a little nervous, but I'm excited to get going. So let's get started. So if you're saying to yourself, why is this such a big deal? Why is this such a big topic or an important video? I just want to show you something. I am here on hellhades.com. Now I come to this website a lot. I talk about this website a lot. It's a great resource. Now you don't have to come to this website. yumilove.net is an excellent resource as well, but I just want to show you one component of the website. If you scroll down on the main page, or on any page really, you can find this Raid Shadow Legends quick links. And there are 4 boxes here that you can select. So you can go ahead and click on auras. And as you can see, there are several different auras available. But if you click on buffs, you can see that there is a huge list of buffs in the game. And then if you click on debuffs, you can see there's an even bigger list of debuffs in the game. And then if you click on instance, you can see there is a massive list of instance in the game. Now, champions may have some of these skills. They may have a lot of these skills. They may only have 1 or 2 of these skills or none of these skills. So these skills start to determine the roles that our champions play on our roster, in the team compositions that we put them in, and in the fights that we take them into. So there are a lot of factors that go into champion roles and team compositions. The good news for you is I'm going to break this down into manageable pieces. I'm going to show you how it all works together, and then we're actually going to get into some practical applications of this at the end of the video. We're going to look at specific champions, specific team compositions, and specific fights in the game. But for right now, we got to do the explanation. So let's get into the theory. Okay, I haven't done one of these in a while, but this is my Raid Fundamentals video on team composition. Now, my Raid Fundamentals videos were actually my very first videos on YouTube, so this has been around for several months already. But I do think that this is a really good title for this video because it covers champion roles, but it's also about team compositions, how we put those roles together in order to make an effective team for any fight in Raid Shadow Legends. Now, first, let's start with a basic team composition. And again, here, you could call it a comp, you can call it a squad, your team, whatever you call it. But your team comp has 2 main goals. And the first goal, obviously, is to defeat the enemy, right? That is the purpose of every team. That is the primary goal. But the second goal of every team is to stay alive. Generally, you think about it this way. You can win a fight one of 2 ways. You can just kill the enemy before they get a chance to kill you, or you can just outlast the enemy. You can be so survivable and so tanky that eventually you just grind them to dust and you're the last one standing. Every team composition is going to employ these 2 methods or these 2 goals in some way. And every single champion that you put onto any team composition in the entire game has to perform at least one, if not both of these goals. Now, that doesn't mean that's their role. We'll get into that just a second. But again, this is what we're thinking about in terms of our team composition. Do we bring a ton of damage to nuke the enemy out before they get a chance? Do we balance damage and survivability so that we have a very versatile composition that can be used in a lot of places? Or do we go with a primarily tanky, survivable team that's just going to outlast the enemy? Might take a long time to win, but it's going to increase our chances of actual victory in the long run. In order to achieve our team's main goals, each champion is going to have one or more of 3 possible roles in the team composition. The first is that the champions are going to do damage. Pretty much every champion does damage in every team composition, but obviously some champions are focused on doing damage, and that's what we mean here. The second one is they are going to create the survive or sustain mechanic. So your team's survival or their ability to sustain the fight is dependent upon these particular champions. And then finally, some champions are going to add utility. Now, adding utility basically means you're going to help the other 2 types of roles do their jobs better. So you're going to help damage dealers do more damage, or you're going to help the sustain champions sustain your team more easily. So when we talk about utility champions, there's always a little bit of flexibility in the language, but basically they don't add utility to the team composition. They add effectiveness to the other champions in the team composition. Now, there are a lot of different skills, buffs, debuffs, instants, all sorts of effects in the game that champions can have, combine, utilize. And for this particular video, we're not going to be talking about the effects that masteries bring. We're not going to be talking about the different gear sets. We're not going to be talking about passives that might be in the game. We're not going to be talking about blessings. We're primarily going to focus on skills that champions have. Let's start with the damage abilities. Now, there are a bunch of damage abilities. You may think that damage comes from your nuker, and that is true. Obviously, that is true. But damage is a goal of your entire team composition. So you want all of your champions to be contributing to your damage overall. Now, some champions are going to be the damage dealers. Some are going to enable those damage dealers. Others are going to keep those damage dealers alive. But whatever it is that a champion is doing, ultimately, you need some damage in order to win a fight. So let's look at some of the different kinds of damage abilities we can bring onto a team composition to accomplish that goal. So first, we're going to start with just damage abilities. And the simplest of all damage abilities are direct damage attacks. That's literally a hit that takes away some health. The second most common type of damage abilities are the damage over time debuffs, so poisons and HP burns. Now, these are especially powerful because they do large amounts of damage, especially to bosses like Clan Boss that have a lot of health, while they're less powerful against champions in places like Arena, where those champions don't have huge HP pools to begin with. Now, I added bombs here as a separate category because they act like direct damage abilities, but they also have a timer and they're a debuff like damage over time debuffs like poison and HP burn. So you need accuracy to land your bombs. And even though the damage doesn't happen over time, it does take some time for those bomb counters to count down. So it's kind of a unique ability in Raid Shadow Legends, but it is another damage ability. And then finally, I decided to include ally attacks here because even though ally attack is an instant ability, and so I could call it an instant ability, it basically gets everybody to attack. So they're doing their direct damage attacks or their damage over time debuffs on their A1s if they have them. They can even drop bombs if they have bombs on their A1. So an ally attack is a utility skill, but it is also a damage ability. Now, in order to maximize the damage that your team is bringing, you are also going to be interested in bringing some champions that can buff your other champions, your damage dealers. Buffs don't need accuracy, and this is one thing that can be very helpful, right? You can always get more stats onto a buffer than a debuffer because a debuffer always requires accuracy. So when you take that need for accuracy away, a buffer can get more speed, more HP, maybe even more damage themselves, depending on what kind of buffer they are. So the most direct way to increase damage is to increase the attack for attack-based champions, increase the defense of defense-based champions, or increase crit rate and crit damage. There's also a relatively uncommon buff, which is counterattack, which can drastically increase your team's damage as well, as long as you're not just trying to wipe the enemy wave out in one hit. If you have a counterattack up, especially in long fights, every time you get hit, you're going to counterattack with that A1. So this is much like an ally attack, but an ally attack is an instant ability, whereas a counterattack is generally a buff. There are other ways to get counterattacks where they act like instant abilities or maybe they're passives, but I'm specifically talking about a champion that brings a counterattack buff for either one champion or the whole team. Next, we have the debuffs that increase our damage. These do require accuracy, and remember that affinity matters for weak hits. So debuffs are a trickier way to increase your damage, but they can be very powerful. The first debuff is decreased defense. That just reduces the damage mitigation on your target. The second is weaken. That doesn't affect the damage mitigation, but instead it just acts like a multiplier for your damage. So you will do 25% more damage when a large weaken is on the target. Poison sensitivity works a lot like weaken, but it works for poisons only, so it increases the damage that poisons do by 25%. And then finally, Hex is a great debuff that will allow you to basically turn single target damage into AoE damage, or it will multiply AoE damage by spreading some of that damage to everybody on the enemy team. So Hex generally isn't a great debuff for single target fights, unless you're getting an additional effect out of that for your particular champion. Just like poison sensitivity isn't great if you're not bringing poisons. However, decreased defense and weaken are the primary ways to increase damage from debuffs in the game. Okay, now we've come to sustain abilities. Now, I don't call these support abilities. They are support abilities, but I think utility abilities are also support abilities. So I wanted to differentiate between the two. These abilities are primarily focused on keeping your team alive and sustaining your ability to extend the fight. The simplest of these are the instant abilities. Heals are the most direct way to sustain the fight, but cleanses and revives are also good ways to keep your team alive and moving. Buffs are another great way to sustain your team, and remember, again, these don't need any accuracy. So shields are like additional health. They act a lot like healing, but it's pretend health, right? It's extra health on top of your health. Then you have all the increased mitigation buffs, increased defense, strengthen, veil, and perfect veil. All of those give you a damage reduction ability. So basically, whether you're increasing the defense to get extra mitigation or using strength and that just takes some damage straight off the top, same thing with veil and perfect veil, by the way, each of these increases your chance of surviving. I put ally protection as its own buff because it acts differently than the other damage mitigations, because some of this damage will go on to the ally protector, potentially even killing your ally protector. So this is probably the closest thing to a tank ability other than like a taunt or a provoke. Next, we have the block damage and unkillable buffs. We know all about these. These are incredibly powerful buffs that can basically negate the possibility of your team dying as long as those buffs are up and we don't have an enemy who can circumvent those particular buffs. So in terms of sustainabilities, these may be in fact the strongest sustainabilities in the game, especially for a situation like a speed-tuned clan boss team. And then finally, we have a revive on death, which acts a lot like a revive, except this is a buff, and so you must die, or the champion must die, when the buff is active. For debuffs that sustain your team, there are a few. Remember that these again require accuracy and can be negated by weak hits. So decrease attack and decrease defense will limit the damage of your enemy damage dealers depending on the stat that they're using. There is no debuff, just like there is no buff for HP-based damage dealers. The only thing that you could do to reduce that damage would be to increase your mitigation or potentially use some of these other debuffs. So decrease crit rate and decrease crit damage will decrease the damage of any damage dealer, even HP-based damage dealers. All of the CC abilities, stun, freeze, provoke, sleep, petrify, fear, true fear, and slow, will reduce the damage output of your enemies, primarily by either keeping them from taking a turn entirely or reducing the number of turns that they're likely to get. So despite the fact that this is impacting the enemy and limiting them, it is in fact reducing the damage that you're taking, and so we consider that a sustain ability. I just realized we also have continuous heals that we didn't put on this buffs list. So instead of healing instantly with just a heal or having a continuous heal buff, we can also get a leech debuff out there, and then every time we do damage to that target, our champions will heal themselves, much like a lifesteal set. Again, I'm not talking about sets, but a lifesteal set would fit the idea of sustaining your team as well. Okay, and finally we come to utility abilities. Now there are two categories. It's not quite the same as buffs and debuffs, but some utility skills take accuracy and some don't. So for the no accuracy required list, we have increased speed, increased turn meter, decrease of ally cooldowns, which can be very powerful. You can also affect the buffs and debuffs on your team. So you want to increase the buff duration to get more value, or decrease the debuff duration to decrease the impact of enemy debuffs. This is very similar to the cleanse ability that we put, I believe, in the sustain ability category. You can also increase the accuracy of your team, giving them more chances to land their debuffs or their instant skills that affect enemies. You can increase your resistance to reduce the enemy's chance of doing the same to your team. And then finally, you can put a block debuffs buff up. Now, I decided to include this as a utility skill and not a sustain skill, because sometimes a block debuffs buff increases your ability to do damage by preventing you from getting debuffed in that way. So it's not just a skill that sustains your team, it can also be a skill that allows them to continue to do the maximum amount of damage. Utility skills that affect the enemy do require accuracy, just like debuffs. At the top of the list here, we have decrease speed or decrease or steal turn meter. So whether it's a decrease or a steal, those are both effective. Obviously, with steal, you get the turn meter, just like you would get the buffs here with the next ability. Remove and steal buffs. We have a decrease of buff duration and an increase of debuff duration. So that's like the inverse or reverse or whatever of the ally utility abilities. So we can take those buffs off of our enemies, reducing their effectiveness, and we can increase any debuffs that we've put on their team in terms of duration, which maximizes the effectiveness of our debuffs. Finally, we have heal reduction and block revive. Both of these abilities should impair the enemy's team's abilities to sustain themselves. Remember that everything that is true about our team composition is also true about the enemy composition, except for the bosses who are like infinitely survivable. So you can't actually kill the clan boss. He never goes away. Same with Hydra boss. But you kill every other boss or every other enemy in the game. You actually defeat them, right? They fall down dead, and that's how you win. So in those particular fights, heal reduction or block revive may prevent them from using those specific abilities, healing and reviving, to sustain their team composition's fight. Okay, so as you can see, there are a lot of buffs, debuffs, instant abilities, and they do break down into damage abilities, survive, sustain abilities, and utility abilities. When you start to put together a team composition, you want to think about how many of these abilities that can you bring, and how does each addition of an ability affect these two main goals: your goal to defeat the enemy and your goal to stay alive. You may not need both, by the way. So we're going to start with an actual team composition that only needs one of these. So let's actually jump into the game and start to look at how all of these abilities combine to create effective team compositions for various fights in the game. Okay, so here we are in Arena, and I'm going to show you my main Arena comp. I've showed this team before. And I'm also going to show you how my understanding of team compositions not only affects how I built my team, but it affects what enemies I choose to fight. Because in the rock, paper, scissors world of gacha games and a lot of games, there are going to be teams I am strong against and teams I am weak against. And my understanding of team compositions is going to tell me which is which and allow me to choose appropriate targets that can maximize my win percentage. So I'm going to come in here to this particular fight. Now, a go first speed team is one of the few types of teams in the game, and Arena is one of the few places in the game where you can basically go for a one-shot kill. You are just going to wipe out the enemy. You don't need sustain on this team. All you need is to be as effective as possible in going first and destroying your enemy. So when we talk about the two main goals of any team composition, this team really only has one: do damage, destroy the enemy, right? We're not worried about the sustain part. Now, that's not typically true in things like boss fights, especially long boss fights like clan boss. But it's always fun to be able to just nuke out the enemy. It's obviously a lot faster than building a tanky team that takes several turns to win. And this is one of those places where you can really perfect speed tuning a go first team and make it extremely effective. But you don't want to take a go first team into every single enemy composition. So right now I'm looking at this enemy here, and this enemy also has a go first composition, but it's not as fast as mine. So maybe it's not a go first enemy composition. If we look at Lissandra here, Lissandra has a nice speed aura in all battles by 24%. She's got a base speed of 110, so she's going to be very fast. She also has this ability to fully deplete a target's turn meter. She has this other ability to increase the speed on all allies with a buff and fill the turn meter of all allies by 30% and decrease the turn meter of all enemies by 30%. This is typically her opener. And then finally, she has an A1 that doesn't really matter that much, at least in terms of the team composition being a go first team composition. So typically, Lissandra would be paired with an Arbiter, and she might be the fastest champion because she's going to get this turn meter fill and this turn meter decrease. In fact, this is a stronger skill even than Arbiter's A3 because it has the same turn meter fill as Arbiter of 30%, but it also affects enemies. Remember, that requires accuracy. So I can assume that I'm probably going to be faster than this team. There's a decent chance that my Arbiter is faster than their Lissandra for two reasons. One is that my aura is 6% faster than their Lissandra's, right? I have a plus 30%, whereas they have a plus 24%. Additionally, even if I weren't faster, I could consider like the turn meter fill that I have with Deacon. I could also think about the resist that I might have. So even if Lissandra goes first, if she can't decrease my turn meter, I might be able to beat her out. This is a +4 Lissandra, so maybe that's going to be tricky because she's going to get extra speed from her +4, and her team power is a little bit higher. So maybe I'm not that confident. Maybe it's a 50-50. But even if I were very confident that I could go first, this would be a bad enemy to take a go first team into, not because of Lissandra, but because of Tormund the Cold. Now, Tormund the Cold has this passive ability. Has a 20% chance, it books to 25% or 30%, books to 30% chance of placing a freeze debuff on the enemy each time they receive a buff or have their turn meter filled. The 20% chance or the 30% chance applies up to twice per enemy turn, once for buffs and once for turn meter fill, in cases where an enemy received multiple of these effects at the same time. So you can have this chance twice. Well, what's my opener? My opener is Arbiter's A3. If we look here at the team setup, you can see that Mentor of Heroes places an increased attack buff on all allies for 2 turns and then fills the turn meter of all allies by 30%. So this skill does both. Gives me a buff and gives me turn meter fill on every single ally. That means every single member of my team composition will be affected potentially twice by Tormund's passive. Each effect, each application is only a 30% chance, right? But there are 2 30% chances to freeze my champions. If any champion on my team gets frozen, chances are I lose. Even if I win the speed race and go first, I lose against Tormund. So I don't take Arbiter teams into Tormund teams. Understanding the roles of these champions and understanding the skills that they use in order to accomplish their roles allows me to not only know how to build a good team, but how to assess the enemies I'm coming up against. Now, are there other team compositions I could make that would beat a Tormund team? Absolutely. But it's not my main arena team. And so unless I want to spend time building a new team or I have a secondary team already built that I want to swap to, it's usually faster and easier to just avoid the teams that in the rock, paper, scissors scenario are the rocks to my scissors, right? I don't want to go into a team where I get countered. And this is a team that counters go first teams. Now let's look at another type of fight that's really important in the game. Let's look at Clan Boss. Okay, so here we are in the Clan Boss. You can see I've done my 1 key for today on Ultra Nightmare. I got 128 million. Now this team composition is speed tuned, but the roles that we bring to our team compositions determine the effectiveness of that team, regardless of if they're killable or unkillable. So let's go ahead and break this team down. Okay, so one thing we have to understand about this team composition is that in order to create a unkillable Clan Boss composition, you need at least one champion to bring either a block damage buff or an unkillable buff. In this case, mine is Helicath. Helicath's A3 places a block damage buff on all allies for 2 turns on a 4-turn cooldown. clearly by himself, Helicath will not be able to make my team entirely unkillable. This block damage buff will come down at some point. Now, I could consider bringing in a buff extension, like I could get a champion that increases the duration of buffs, except for the fact that block damage can't be extended. Block damage and unkillable are two of the buffs that cannot be extended. I think the third is revive on death. So I'm going to need champions that help me make this team unkillable. One way to improve the effect of this skill is to reduce the cooldown. And so that's why I brought Renegade. Now, Renegade has her A3 here that decreases the cooldown of all ally skills by 2 turns. So if this skill fires off often enough, I can reduce Helicath's 4-turn cooldown down to a 2-turn cooldown. However, you'll notice this has its own cooldown of 6 turns. I could get this down to 5, but it was actually easier to speed tune at 6. That's a subject of another video. Now, again, because this has a very long cooldown, probably by itself it will not be enough, and so I've brought in a third champion, and that is Seeker. Now, what Seeker does is fills the turn meter of all allies by 30%. This also places an increased attack buff, which is going to get me more damage, and then it grants an extra turn. So this turn meter fill is going to happen a lot. It happens every other turn that Seeker goes. So if I can get him fast enough, he is going to be using this at least once for every turn that the clan boss goes, meaning everybody is going to be going at least 30% faster than they would normally because they get 30% turn meter fill. Now, it's not quite perfect, so you can have some inefficiency here, but in general, when you hit the right speeds, you're getting a huge boost to your speed. Now, these 3 champions create the unkillable composition because they get all of my champions fast enough, and then they also get the cooldowns to the right place with the block damage debuff to create an unkillable composition. Now, there are a lot of other roles that you have in a clan boss team, but this is my sustain trio. These 3 champions are all doing sustain jobs, but they're also doing additional jobs. For instance, my Helicath's A1 is a weaken. That's going to allow me to do more damage. Seeker's A2, in addition to the turn meter fill, gives me that increased attack, which is going to allow all of my champions, except for Helicath, to do more damage. Helicath is defense-based. Now, the simplest role here is Ninja. Ninja is my straight-up damage dealer, but he does a few things in addition to bringing just damage abilities. His A1 has a chance of bringing a decreased defense, which will improve everybody's damage. He has an HP burn on his A2, which will give me a secondary form of damage in addition to the direct damage he brings. And then he also has an escalation passive, which makes him do more damage over time. So he's bringing damage not just for himself, but with that decreased defense, he's also increasing the damage of the rest of the team. Finally, my Cardiel is doing a little bit of everything here. This is probably the most important champion in the team after Helicath, not because he's necessary, but because he does so many roles. So the first thing that he has is actually a speed aura of 19% in all battles that allows me to reach the necessary speeds more easily. That also allows me to reduce the stat allowance in speed for every champion and get more of those stats into the damage areas of their builds. So even without doing anything, he's already increased the damage of my team. Now, Cardiel's A1 is a very good skill in a lot of places because it heals all allies and it places True Fears on some enemies. But neither one of those effects will apply to the clan boss. So this is basically his only attack, and he's going to be using it primarily as an attack. It hits decently hard, but he's a support champion, so you might think, okay, he's not really adding to the damage job of the team composition. But that wouldn't be true, because he has several other ways to add to the damage total that our team's going to be putting out. The A3 places increased crit rate and increased damage buff on all allies, and then it becomes an all-ally attack. So this is actually increasing our damage in 3 different ways. Increased crit rate allows me to build Ninja, say, with only 70% crit rate, and increased crit damage means everybody's going to do more damage on their crits. In addition, it's an ally attack, which is going to get everybody else an additional attack. So this is going to be a 5 champion attack. That's going to maximize the amount of damage that my team can do simply by getting more attacks out there. In addition, Cardiel has this passive, which gives him a 30% chance to team up with an ally and join their attack. So he's going to be attacking more often than anybody else on the team other than Seeker, who just gets so many extra turns. And remember that all of these champions have their tier 6 damage masteries. So they either have Giant Slayer or War Master. And so those masteries will proc not only when the champion gets their turn, but when they attack with Cardiel's ally attack. And Cardiel will get his War Master proc not only on his turn, but on any turns when he joins his allies on those 30% chances. Finally, Cardiel brings another really important ability here, and that is not only a cleanse, but a block debuffs buff. He brings a revive on death that won't play here. Again, we're unkillable, but he can block the stun and he can cleanse the slow from the Spirit Affinity boss. So he does several things with this ability that help me be affinity friendly. Now, when you're looking at this team composition, you might be like, hey, those are some crazy champions, but the champions aren't all that important. What's important is the role. You can build an unkillable team with Demitha, but Demitha is going to require a very fast team or a lot of help in terms of getting all of the turns that she needs to make sure that you're unkillable 100% of the time. You still need to bring in some way to manage the stun, so that is either a cleanse or a block debuffs buff. You need damage, poisons, HP burns, direct damage, decreased defenses, anything that can maximize the damage on the clan boss. And you can get those from tons of different champions. There are literally thousands of effective clan boss compositions, but every effective clan boss composition has 5 champions who work well together to cover all of the various roles needed to keep their team going and to do damage. Okay, so how does this affect you as you're moving through the game? Well, the first thing that you need to understand is that all of those buffs, debuffs, and instant effects are out there, and you can start to look for champions that bring something new to your roster that you don't currently have. So I'm going to take you over to my new account, and I'm going to walk you through my very limited roster over there and give you an assessment about not only what every champion can do for me, but what kind of champions that I would look for different fights in the game. Okay, so here I am on my level 50 account. This is my noob versus pro account that I just started. We can even look, I think it's about 40 something days, 45 days ago. Now, if we look at the roster here, I have a very limited roster. But one of the things that you want to consider is what champions do you need in your roster? And when you get a champion, is it worthy of a 6-star right away? Now, one of the aspects of determining this is going to be understanding what you need to bring into each and every fight that you are trying to accomplish. So right now, where I stand on this account, one of my most immediate goals is pushing all of my dungeons. Another is continuing to improve an arena. And a third is getting my clan boss team up to at least brutal. So those are my 3 primary areas of focus, probably clan boss first and then the others. But I need to choose champions to take to 6-star that are going to help me in at least one of those places, if not multiple places. Now I'm going to show you my initial team here. So I had Deacon Armstrong as my promo code champion. Sun Wukong obviously is a free login reward, and Athel was my starter champion. So these were my first 3 champions. I also happened to get Jamarsa as a referral reward. So these were my first 3 champions, and then Jamarsa was my 4th champion that I got that were pretty good, that were worth investing in. I didn't get anybody else early in the game. At one point, I was stuck on the idea of who to 6-star next, and I went with Shield Guard, and I'll talk about why in just a second. And then in more recent days, I got Roomkeeper Dazder, who I took to 6-star. I've got Frozen Banshee, who I took to 6-star. And I've got Stagnite, who will probably be my next 6-star. So if we just look at these 8 champions fight on every team that I have in the entire game. And each and every one of them brings at least one unique ability to my roster. Now forget Athel for a second, or at least don't forget her, but realize that every starter champion is just super important. You're going to 6-star them. Athel actually brings me something that nobody else does, that the other starter champions wouldn't. She brings on her A1 a weaken. It is a 100% chance of placing a weaken. Now, she is magic affinity. She can weak hit, but she's my only weaken champion, and that can massively increase the amount of damage I do to a boss. If we look at Shield Guard brings a skill that I don't really have anywhere else on my roster, or I didn't before I got Stagnite. And that is an A1 that has a decreased speed. He's also a defensive-based champion, so I can build him tanky and do damage at the same time. He also gets a turn meter fill on his A2, which is a nice solid AoE. And the reason I really built him is because I didn't have a clear next 6-star, and I didn't want to waste my resources on an epic, let's say, when I could get a uncommon who's very cheap to build. I can book him out for free just with copies of himself and get a lot of value out of him, and then wait a little while to get my next epic or legendary. And my very next epic was Runekeeper Dazdurk, so it worked out perfectly. Now, Runekeeper Dazdurk brings a unique skill to my roster. He brings an increased attack. I don't have that anywhere else. Now, he also brings turn meter fill, which is great. Some abilities or some roles you're going to want in multiples. So I have turn meter fill from Runekeeper Dazdurk, and I have turn meter fill from Deacon Armstrong, and that overlap is not useless, right? I also have turn meter fill from my High Katoon, who I got at 30 days. So I have 3 turn meter fill champions. High Katoon also brings an increased speed, which I don't have anywhere else on my roster. So I am considering bringing her up after Stagnite. Deacon Armstrong brings a unique ability to my roster. He has an increased speed in all battles aura, which I didn't have before I got High Katoon, so he was my one and only speed aura lead. He also has a leech on his A1, which, by the way, Runekeeper Dazdurk has that, so I now have that doubled up. He has an AoE drop defense, which I didn't have anywhere else on my roster before getting Stagnite. And then he also has a turn meter fill and a decreased turn meter of all enemies. I don't have that decrease of turn meter of all enemies, or I didn't anywhere else on the roster. But again, you could have multiple copies of turn meter fill and turn meter decrease. Wukong brings a unique ability. His A3 is a buff steal. So he steals buffs, and then he also places block buffs, debuffs. Neither one of these abilities is anywhere else in my roster. Frozen Banshee brings a unique ability, actually 2 unique abilities to my team. As you can see, I did not have another poisoner, and she has poisons on her A1. She also brings a poison sensitivity on her A3, and I had neither of those. Now, finally, I got Stagnite, and Stagnite actually doubles up a lot of the things that some of the other champions do. So his A1 has a decreased speed, like Shield Guard, and his A2 has a decreased defense, like it's an AoE decreased defense, like Deacon Armstrong has. But he also brings a decreased attack that nobody else brought. So every single one of my first 8 champions, oh, I forgot Jamarsa. Okay, what does Jamarsa bring? Well, Jamarsa brings a heal. Now, she was my first healer. Runekeeper Dazdurk also brings a heal. His is better because it's an AoE. She has her A3, which revives all dead allies with 30% HP and 30% turn meter. I do not have another reviver, so that is a unique ability. She has a passive that decreases the cooldowns of ally skills. That's a unique ability for me. And then she even has a sleep on her A1, another unique ability. So all 8 of my first champions are bringing things that most of the other champions don't have. When I've decided to double up on skills, it's for specific reasons. So the fact that I am bringing up Stagnite, despite the fact that he's doubling up on a lot of skills, is for a few reasons. 1, he brings that increased attack that nobody else brings, and that's incredibly important. And then 2, he actually does 3 things on 2 skills. He has that slow, he has the decreased attack, and the decreased defense. This is a lot more bang for your buck than I'm getting for Shield Guard. Right? Shield Guard brings a slow, but not much else. And by the way, his slow, when maxed out, is a 35% chance. Whereas if you look at the A1 of Stagnite, each hit when booked has a 50% chance. So this is a 75% chance of landing a decreased speed. So decreased speed is so important. I want more reliability there. And also I can use him for my slow in fights where a decreased attack would also be useful. So swapping in Stagnite and taking out Shield Guard in boss fights makes a lot of sense. And in fact, I'm going to just transition Shield Guard probably to be my campaign farmer eventually, and Stagnite will take his place in all content wherever else he was being used. So now the question becomes, what am I looking for next? Well, there are several things that I could use that I don't have. I don't have a block debuffs buff. I don't have an increased defense. I don't have an ally protection. I don't have significant shields anywhere. All of these are roles that I would be looking to fill. I don't have a champion with an AoE stun, provoke, or freeze. That would be additional utility. So if I pull a champion that brings me one of those roles that I don't have anywhere else on my roster, that champion is very likely to get 6-starred in the near future. But I can also look at the specific fights that I was talking about. I'm looking at dungeons, I'm looking at arena, and I'm looking at clan boss. So let me show you those 3 teams. Now, first here in arena, you can see that this is my arena team. I have a nice speed aura of 28% from Wukong. I have 2 turn meter fillers. Runekeeper Dazdurk is my fastest champion. He gives a turn meter fill of 25% plus an increased attack on the same ability. Deacon Armstrong is the second. He has turn meter fill and decreased defense on the same ability. So I get my increased attack and decreased defense and turn meter fill all from 2 champions. Then Wukong goes third, removes all the buffs from the enemies and places a block debuffs on them. And then Athel nukes them out at the end. Again, she'll have the increased attack and the decreased defense out there, so she'll hit as hard as possible. This is a perfectly speed-tuned comp, and this should get me all the way to gold 5 without any new champions. Athel may be replaced with a better nuker, or I could eventually specialize her as a arena nuker and switch her speed boots to attack percentage boots, and that would allow her to be my arena nuker all the way to gold 5. You can do that with a starter champion. It's tricky, but basically you just need to specialize her and you need good gear. So the thing that is preventing me from climbing higher than gold 1 right now is the fact that I don't have the gear that I need. Also, you can see Wukong and Deacon are still at level 50. So once I get them each to level 60, I will start to climb more effectively. But in the meantime, I'm doing a great job here in gold 1, and I'm only 45 days into the game. And I don't need to look for any more champions for this team. But just like my Go First team on my main team, I want to avoid team compositions that counter this team. So this one right here that I'm going up against is a 50-50. It's pretty tanky. They've got Artak and Duchess. They've got a Reviver. They've got a block debuffs buff. There's a lot going on here. They've also got Ninja who can hit pretty hard. So I think this team is pretty tricky, and I'm going to avoid them for now. Okay, so now here is my Fire Knight team. Now, this team needs some help. In order to defeat Fire Knight, you need several things. One is you need to be able to clear the waves effectively and get to the boss. 2, you need multi-hitters to break the boss's shield. And then 3, preferably you get some turn meter control to keep the boss from going over and over again. So if you can defeat him without letting him take a turn, that's good. Or at least if you can reduce the number of turns he takes, that's good too. But if he's going to take some turns, you'll need some sustain. Now I have mostly multi-hitters here. I do have 2 slows, but I don't have a good replacement for Shield Guard here. Shield Guard is here because he was my initial slow. And now that Stag Knight is a slow, I'd rather just have 2 because that would give me more chances of getting a slow. And Shield Guard is good against the waves. But if I could get somebody who has a triple hit or has some turn meter reduction like Allure, or maybe even I could build out an Armiger and use him in this fight. So he would still only be a single hitter, but Shield Guard is a single hitter. So as long as I can break the shield, Armiger would give me turn meter reduction. I don't need any more damage here. I have plenty of damage with the champions that I've got, but I could still really use a Fire Knight specialist. So if I get one of those, that may be a champion that I build up relatively soon, at least to 50, if not to 60. In Spider's Den, I have a slightly different team, and I will probably be swapping out Shield Guard here for Stag Knight. The decreased attack is going to help me sustain my team for longer, which is going to be necessary against this boss. Again, I don't have turn meter reduction. So the same champion that could potentially help me against Fire Knight could help me more against Spider Boss. Maybe somebody like a Cold Heart with 100% turn meter reduction and a big hit. Or again, maybe somebody like that Allure. Or maybe even somebody like Royal Guard who has a decreased speed, some turn meter reduction, and a lot of damage. In this case, I have Wukong in here because he's a great Spiderling tank, because when they kill him, he just comes back to life, and then they have to kill him again. So as you can see, understanding what my arena team has allows me to choose my enemies carefully and maximize my chance of winning battles. And understanding what my team compositions need to improve in dungeons allows me to project what kind of 6 stars I might level up next. Now let's take a final look at the Clan Boss team. Okay, so here is my Clan Boss team. And as you can see, it's most of the same champions, right? I don't have that big roster here. But I have Frozen Banshee in here, who is that poison and poison sensitivity champion. She's going to be my primary damage dealer here. Athel is bringing a weaken. Deacon Armstrong and Stagnite are bringing decreased defenses. This could be really helpful when I'm going against the weak affinity. I get an extra chance of decreased defense. Stagnite brings decreased attack, which increases my survivability. Deacon and Runekeeper Dazdurk each bring a leech, which improves my survivability. Those are sustained skills. Runekeeper Dazdurk gives me an increased attack, which increases my damage. He also gives me turn meter fill, as does Deacon Armstrong, which allows me to get more turns. As soon as I can get everybody to 6-star and get their War Master masteries, that's going to increase my damage further. And those extra stats will also help me both with speed and with survivability. So in this team, I am bringing damage abilities, sustain abilities, utility abilities, and every champion has a purpose for being here. And they are all filling more than one role, or they are filling one role very well. For instance, Frozen Banshee basically is bringing damage and nothing else. But she does that very well for a rare champion, and she should get me all the way through Nightmare and maybe into Ultra Nightmare. So I don't really need to replace anybody in this team just yet. What I will be looking for is an unkillable champion. So I'll be looking for a Man-Eater or a Demitha, preferably because those are epics, or maybe a Helicath or a Rosgard the Tower or an Emic Trunkheart. Any of those legendaries could also help me create an unkillable composition. Now, if I find a replacement for one of these champions, for instance, if I can find a weakened champion that can replace Athel and also bring additional sustain abilities like an increased defense or a shield or a strengthen, then I might swap her out. Likewise, if I could find a decreased attack champion that brings me more rolls or more skills, I could swap out Stagnite and get maybe a decreased attack plus, again, a strengthen or an ally protect. And that is how you envision your team compositions moving forward. You want to have a clear perception of what roles you have, what roles you're lacking, what roles are valuable for the fight that you're in, and then you start looking for champions who can bring those additional abilities. And remember, we don't want to lose abilities. The abilities that we have are important, but if we have one that's doubled up, let's say here we have a 2 decreased defenses, we know that maybe one of those champions is expendable. Okay, that was a lot of ground that we just covered. Again, I think this is an incredibly important video. I hope that it informed you without confusing you, and I hope it also gave you enough information to be helpful because there's a ton more to cover still. But remember that when you are building a team composition, you are looking for all of those roles. And we talked about choosing champions that were valuable or understanding why champions are valuable. So when you see a champion who's rated really highly and you're wondering why, sometimes it's just based around their special ability to do one thing well. Like somebody does damage better than anybody else. Acrizia is like that. She just hits harder than every other champion. But in most cases, it isn't the ability to do one job well. It's the ability to bring multiple jobs or fulfill multiple roles on a team composition. When you think about all the things you need for Clan Boss, or all of the things that you need on a team composition for the Hydra Boss, champions who can fill multiple roles become much and much more valuable. So if you're looking to flesh out your roster, look for champions that do multiple jobs. I talk about Scylla the Drakes all the time. One of the reasons Scylla the Drakes is so important is because she does really important jobs and she does a lot of them. Really quickly, why is she so valuable? Well, let's look at the jobs that she does. She does a decreased speed, that's one job. She does a decreased turn meter, that's 2 jobs. She has an AoE stun, that's 3 jobs. She has a revive, that's 4 jobs. She has a passive that heals, that's 5 jobs. And then she does damage on her A1 and her A2, that's 6 jobs. She does 6 jobs, at least 2 or 3 of which you will need in almost every fight in the game. Some of them are sustain skills, some of them are utility skills, and some of them are damage skills. That's why a champion like this is so incredibly valuable, especially to a free-to-play account. Okay, now that is really it. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about this video. Are you going to share it with your clanmates? Are you going to share it with your Discord community? Do you feel like I covered enough material to help you start to understand how to build team compositions? Or would you like more specific videos? I can build some team compositions for you and show you how they work in terms of this specific concept. Honestly, I'm just hoping I did the subject justice. Anyway, I'm going to end it here. Thanks so much for hanging out. If you've made it all the way to the end of the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and do link this video to your clanmates and your Discord community so we can get this important topic in front of as many eyes as possible. I really think it can help the community out. Thanks so much for all your support. Thanks for watching. I will see you in another video